Dear friends, dear colleagues, dear fans of the History on the Edge series, we are back again. I'm very happy to introduce our visiting fellow, Maja Lorbek. She will held a lecture entitled New Schools for New Education, Multilateralism and School Construction, 1944-1970. Maja Lorbek is a senior research fellow at the University of Applied Arts, Vienna, Austria. She is an architectural historian with an interdisciplinary background. She holds a PhD in architecture from TU Wien and has previously worked as a lecturer at TU Wien and Department of Housing and Design and as a research coordinator at the Leibniz Institute of Ecological, Urban and Regional Research in Dresden. Currently, she is the principal investigator of the Austrian Science Fund-funded research project called Transitional School Construction at the Department of Design History and Theory, University of Applied Arts, Vienna. Additionally, she serves as a coordinator of the working group Residential Buildings and Architectural Design within the European Network for Housing Research. Dr. Lorbek's research interests lie at the intersection of the history and co-production of the built environment and material cultures. Her recent studies have focused on international organizations and post-war school building programs. As already mentioned, her lecture is titled New Schools for New Education, Multilateralism and School Construction, 1944-1970. Maja, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. The project is actually called Transnational School Construction, but doesn't matter. School construction is also transitional. It is funded by the Austrian...
Mistake, I suppose.
It is funded by the Austrian Science Fund, and the initial idea was to look at the working group that worked within the framework of a specific architectural association that was founded immediately after the war, Union Internationale des Architectes, UIA. And the idea was to look at how this commission influenced national context of school construction and how vice versa, these local spheres in Austria, we're focusing on Austria, Yugoslavia with a specific focus on Slovenia, and the third country is GDR. How are they each influencing each other? Well, in the course of research, it became obvious that there were other institutions and international organizations involved, and I will focus on these organizations in this lecture. This is an ongoing research, so kind of a work in progress. I will try to convey the relations between these organizations and also how it played out in actual school building in some of the national and regional contexts. So, but I will start explaining the terms from my title. The first one is new education. This is for me a generic term, a catch-all term for all kinds of reform pedagogic in German, also new education, progressive education, functional school. The list you see here was compiled by Hofstetter and Schöwli, and I added reformska pedagogika, sodobna pedagogika, which means in English contemporary pedagogy. And most of the documents which are associated with the Yugoslav school reform of the 1950s, they speak mostly about contemporary pedagogy. So the next term is multilateralism. The first one is educational internationalism, another term by Hofstetter and Schöwli, and also Drew. This means the longer tradition of new education, which is particularly active during the interwar period and where education is linked to pacifist movement and education is seen as a vehicle for promoting world peace immediately after World War II. These changes somewhat after World War II, when these big agencies like UNESCO, UN, the World Bank, and so on are established by the big forces. And here we can talk about multilateralism, and this term was first defined by Karen Mundy, and she talks about redistributive multilateralism, Western countries or even socialist countries helping the not so developed global South through technical aid and loans and other initiatives. But later on, particularly during the 1970s, this takes more disciplinary forms. Think perhaps OECD and PISA. So the next term is, I'm finally coming to architecture and school construction, and architecture, as other ideas, travels across the world, and so do building types. Lukasz Stanek, who has explored this in the context of African countries and socialist the socialist bloc, talks about mobilities of architecture. Ezra Axon has used the term translation for bringing housing, for instance, from the German context, when particularly German architects in the interwar period went to Turkey, and then they started organizing housing construction there. And then there's this the oldest theory about this is the social construction of building types. This is the idea that was introduced by Anthony B. King and his seminal book on the bungalows. And here I can, perhaps for non-architects, it's easier to understand this notion of traveling types. The bungalow was in Bangladesh, understood as a Bengali-style house. Then in India, it's conceived as a single-family home. Then in the UK and French context, bungalows are small holiday homes. And then finally, we have the German bungalow, which is styled upon the Californian modernist style, Richard Neutra. And perhaps the most famous one is the one built in Bonn for Erhard in the 1960s. And also, sometimes even typal components travel along and are assembled in a different way. This is something I wrote about in 22. So I'm self-citing myself. So finally, we get to education. And immediately after World War II, we have these humanist ideals of education, education for peace, which is a continued tradition from the interwar period. It's about emancipation, egalitarianism. It is also a much longer tradition of state and nation building, which goes back to the 19th and 18th century. And this, of course, has some it's, of course, important because we have these newly emerged countries which need yet to establish their national school systems during the late 1950s and especially during the 1960s. And we have, and the international organizations during this time promote one worldism. This is especially linked to Julian Huxley of UNESCO and also later on development. So this is just to remind you of this idea of linking education and peace. This is the preamble to the constitution of the UNESCO, and you can read the sentence for yourself. So let's start with UNESCO. I won't be telling you about the history of UNESCO, but about their school construction initiatives. This started during the 1950s. This was mostly linked to technical assistance. Yugoslavia was among the countries which had technical assistance from UNESCO, but also in Africa, Asia, Latin America. And this was mainly in the form of UNESCO experts, mostly Western experts, who were commissioned to go there and maybe develop some prototypal schools and help with the construction later on. This was professionalized, and UNESCO established regional school building centers in Africa, Latin America, and also in Asia. And in 1964, they established an educational planning division with a young architect, a young MIT graduate, John Bainon. And this led to some tensions with my organization which is at the focus of my research. So how this played in the national context of Yugoslavia, for instance. Yugoslavia joined UNESCO in 1950. In 1951, the first agreement was signed, and then one of the first initiatives was to establish an Institute of School Equipment in Zagreb, Zavod za školsku opremu. And here's the direct, and it was not just about teaching aids and teaching tools and also furniture, but the initial task of this institute was also to develop perhaps prototypes for school buildings. And William Kunst, who was actually a Slovenian school teacher, became the first director, and his UNESCO fellowship was dedicated to school buildings. And then in 1956, there were foreign experts coming to Yugoslavia, and the Yugoslavs especially demanded that an expert for school buildings should come, and this was the Danish expert Hans Henning Hansen, and he wrote recommendations which did have some influence on how school construction program unfolded during the school reform in the late 1950s. Perhaps the most interesting idea is that was perhaps floating around, but he claimed that this was a practice that was already done in Croatia. So there's a system of main school and subsidiary schools, glavna šola in podružnične šole, and he called this a planetary system of schools. And there is also some school mapping involved, distributing schools across the territory. So this is a kind of an early example of educational planning, I would say. And also there was quite a unique collaboration between educators and architects, but I will tell you about this in just a moment. So there's the next organization, which was there for much longer, from the interwar period. It emerged from the Institut Rousseau in Geneva, and here we have this well-known Genevan school of reform pedagogy like Clapret, Beauvais, and so on. It gained intergovernmental status in 1929, meaning that countries were members of this organization, and they started to organize a conference where high officials from ministries of education and sometimes even ministers of education met, and then they tried to learn from each other, and also to define the recommendations which national members could use within their own context. And they started to use Paley-Wilson in 1936. So after the war, when UNESCO emerged, it was, of course, a competition for the IBE, but thanks to the diplomatic skills of Jean Piaget, who was also a well-known psychologist. This is what Rita Hofstetter and Schöfli write a lot. He was able to reach an agreement, and they were able to retain an autonomy. So they started to organize these conferences, these yearly conferences, jointly. So in 1969, after Piaget resigned, IBE became a UNESCO agency. So IBE, even though it was focused on educational topics, it started to look into school construction quite early. In 1934, they did a survey on school building regulations, and one of the early regulations from 1936 makes some provisions for how schools should be built. The focus is, of course, on the activity method and activity school. The schools should have access to green and open spaces, and they should be located on town periphery because there is more space for such activities. Then in 1951, when discussing the main topic of compulsory education, again, school construction was addressed, and it was called the problem of school building, le problème de construction scolaire, which is kind of an inspiration for my organization, which is called Commission de Construction Scolaire, and there are some other linkages as well. So, and what you can see on those white inserts is the Slovenian secretary within the Council of Education, Viktor Gabrovšek, saying that it is therefore necessary that architects in school building devote deeper study to new principles and new methods in education before they start designing schools. He proposed that this would be amended to the recommendations. Unfortunately, this was declined. The others didn't agree, but still he was quite vocal during this conference. And also other well-known names from the Yugoslav school reform attended, names like Miloš Žanko, and also Josip Lukatela. And in 1957, when the topic was the expansion of a school building, they even took the Slovenian architect Danilo Fürst along. So he was able to attend this illustrious conference. IBE, in its recommendation number 44, gave out kind of a roadmap how to organize school building programs. Of course, you need survey of needs. Trust in numbers is not just important for states, but also for international organizations like UNESCO and IBE. They operate a lot with surveying and having data. Of course, you need to have administrative measures when you're building schools. We need to know who's making the decisions, as who's in charge. And if you look at Yugoslavia, which is changing the competencies all the time, it's not so easy. Also, I think that this emergency measures proposal is quite interesting, that while the school system is in flux, while the reform is ongoing, you need to have perhaps some temporary buildings or use other buildings, but this is something that was not taken into account by the national actors. And of course, international cooperation is quite important. So finally, we come to the Union Internationale des Architectes. It was founded in Lausanne, very near to Geneva, which is kind of significant. In 1948, it was obviously an NGO. It was an association of associations, so only architects' councils and other national associations could become members, but they did have little resources, and of course, the main actors were architects who were also freelance architects who had to deal with their commissions, and they were devoting their free time to this organization. In 1951, in the same year that the problem of school building was addressed in the IBE, Jean-Pierre Vougat, who was one of the driving forces behind this commission, founded the Commission de Construction Scolaire. And then in 1951, is the year that Yugoslavia also joined UIA, and there was this first conundrum with the Polish delegation, which didn't want Yugoslavia to join because of the Stalin-Tito split, and Helena Sirkus, the Polish architect, intervened on this behalf, but Pierre Vagot was staunchly in favor of international cooperation and everyone should be admitted. And then the Americans intervened. Vladimir Kulic wrote about this in his PhD, so I'm not going to go about this much longer. In 1953, I think, Oton Gaspari, again, the Slovenian architect, became the national delegate to this commission. So I will tell you about this other stuff in this bullet point list a bit later. So I'll continue. Here you can see some of the faces. Perhaps I didn't put Jean-Pierre Vougat, who was kind of a gray eminence behind all this. He was not actually a member, but he did a lot for the commission. Then the first president was Alfred Roth, who was quite a prominent school building expert. I would say the most prominent school building expert of the early post-war era. We have Oton Gaspari. The Austrian is Wilhelm Schutte, the man from former husband at this time of Margarete Schutte-Lichotzky. Then later on Lukas Lang, and then we have the Bundesdeutsche Gunther Wilhelm, and Helmut Trautzettel, who served for the GDR. The female architects, unfortunately, did not have much of a role, and it's tellingly that they both come from the Eastern Bloc. One is Danuta Mieszkowska, who was actually a member, and Svetla Karfikova only participated and had some lectures. So this is about Alfred Roth, who also quite significantly influenced this commission. And in 1950, he published his trilingual book, The New Schoolhouse, Das neue Schulhaus, La Nouvelle École. And this is there's a specific context on how schools should be organized. And I will tell you about this just in a moment. He assembled different ideas, predominantly from the US-American context, and then defined his concept of how a contemporary or a modern or a new school should look like. One of his ideas taken from William Caudill was to group different functions together. You have an administrative tract, you have a tract where classrooms are located, and then perhaps school facilities. But the most, I think, the one thing that was quite important for him is this expansion of the classroom unit, which is a bit of a translation of the principles of new education into architecture, the idea of the active method, where you have the main classroom, then an attached open-air classroom, a small niche or a hobby room, and then in some cases also a wardrobe and sanitary unit. So the teacher and his group of pupils kind of have this expanded classroom. This idea goes back to Richard Neutra, who called it activity classroom in 1928 already. And Stillman and Clearson, which published a book on school buildings in 1948, I think, called it the Neutra plan. And these diagrams with this God's eye in the middle, which is probably the teacher, these are Alfred Roth's showing different schemes of classroom units. So, and this was also taken up into the commission, Commission de Construction Scolaire, and its first publication. You don't see this because it's underneath this label. They said it was done on behalf of the UNESCO, but UNESCO gave them just a small subvention. So Jean-Pierre Bougat had to obtain funds in order to get this published. The introduction is by Alfred Roth, and it is mainly the ideas that he had in his trilingual book. But then you have like surveys for each of the member countries. This one shown here is on Yugoslavia. Each of the delegates had to assemble data on their school systems, and they also included photographs and floor plans. For the Yugoslav report, there was data for Slovenia only, obviously because Gabrošek and Gaspari had this data. The German architect had to improvise and get his data from elsewhere, and Schutter was actually asked to do a report for Austria, but the Ministry of Education didn't want to supply them. So this is a school that is actually shown in the report. The school was built in 1954 by Gaspari, and you can see that he took up some of Roth's ideas, but adapted them a little bit. So the open-air classroom is not attached directly to the classroom, and we have a wardrobe, and of course there's scarcity and lack of school space during this time in Yugoslavia. This is why there's no hobby room and so on. So, and you can see here the bilateral lighting through the ray of light. Yeah, but I was able to look, thanks to this fellowship, I was able to look at the school chronicles, and unfortunately these open-air classrooms did not play much role in practice in this school, but still they were very proud of their school. At the same time, these organizations also tried to define some school building norms, and actually the Yugoslavs or the Slovenian part of the commission was ahead of them. They published preliminary school building norms in 1958, and then in 1959, Charter of School Buildings was published by the UIA. And these school building regulations do address the idea of the active method and new education. Yeah, but now we have already reached that. This was in 59, and now we've come to the year 1960s, and in the 60s, education changes. It is no longer about humanism and self-development and personal growth or equality and egalitarianism, but education is now linked to economic growth. And this is mostly defined by, there's a new organization which takes on education. The OECD or the Marshall Plan is looking for what to do now. Now the Marshall Plan has been finished, and they take up education even if this was not their initial objective. And there's also an International Institute of Educational Planning, which adheres to this idea of manpower planning, of defining how many well-educated people you need in order for your economy to grow. And the schools shift from these small pavilion-type small schools with big gardens. The focus is now on community centers, and it's also about flexibility and prefabrication. So here's an overview of all of these organizations. We can see the big three, the UNESCO, OECD, and the World Bank. And then we have this not very powerful, but still important Commission on School Construction. And during the London UNESCO Conference on Educational Buildings, there's a UNESCO decision that an international center for school construction should be founded, and also each national member is also advised to establish its own center. There are some centers which were there for much longer, like the one in Italy and in the Netherlands, also in Mexico, and of course the famous Architects and Buildings Division in the UK. And Austria and Federal Republic of Germany actually found their school building centers in 1954. But of course, I mean, you can see the geopolitical divides in this setting, because UNESCO kind of takes off the rest of the world, Africa, Asia, Latin America. OECD is dominating Western Europe and in part a bit also Yugoslavia. Yeah, that, and the commission, the UIA Commission, makes an attempt to organize an international center at Lausanne, which is perhaps a bit modeled upon the International Bureau of Education. The idea is to share knowledge and define school buildings and learn from each other. They even include Jean Piaget and Robert Detron. And Switzerland, which is obviously keen on having another agency on the Lake Geneva, on the Lake Léman, is financing this for 5 years, but they see that this is not going anywhere, and they would hope that, of course, the UIA hope that UNESCO will finance this center, but eventually it fails. But there's something else that comes out of it, which you will see in just a second. So this is also how these small schools were organized in Mexico and also in Morocco. And there's this shift in scale when you look at school buildings. It's about bigger, larger buildings because both Eastern Bloc and the Western countries are expanding their secondary education. We have the baby boom, so they need larger schools. And here are two different solutions for this problem. One is using large panel constructions, which were developed for housing in the GDR, and they are adapted to be used in schooling. And the Canton Vaud, this comes directly out of the International Center for School Construction. It's an open system of prefabrication, and so it uses different types of building components, very much like having this overflow of different products in the Western capitalist system versus perhaps not having so much diversity in products in the other part of the world. So this is under the influence of OECD. There was a Mediterranean regional project in which Yugoslavia was involved with some other Mediterranean countries, and they tried to define the need for skilled workers, and the DEEB project was part of this, efficiently and economically building schools. And because Slovenia or Yugoslavia didn't have so much prefabricated production, they kind of decided upon standardizing just some building components. And this is one of the schools that was built with this approach. This is another example of the Croc system, which was linked to the Lausanne TIC Center. And perhaps you've noticed, even as non-architects, that we've gone from this expanded classroom to a more rigid system of school construction, because modular grids and prefabricated components, even if architects hope that this would bring flexibility and anticipate future educational methods which are not yet known, perhaps something like a TV school, which was discussed a lot during this time, I would say the opposite happened. This is also an example in the same vein, the modular grid, and there was actually an office for economic construction of schools in Zagreb at the Institute of Školska oprema. So, and this is another example of how this was played out in the local context. Austria also participated in the manpower planning project, the so-called IP project. You can see this very cynically, defining a certain percentage of a school cohort in cities, in less populated areas and sparsely populated areas. Some percentage will go to a secondary school, some others will go to universities, and so on. This can be cynical, but it does have also good sides to it, because I think it does try to allocate the resources more justly. So even someone who grows up in a small rural village perhaps has more chances to get to matura or maybe to university degree than before. This is another example, and also Hallenschule and school centers and these big central halls are quite important during the 1960s in Austria, and prefabrication for Austria is also evaluated, but due to the shape of the construction industry, not possible. So this is what I've told you about the school architecture. There's some rigidity in spatial organization. There's the potentially you can change the rooms and use open plan concepts, but this doesn't have much impact on the practice in schools. And it kind of shifts towards inward. Instead of open air and green spaces around the school, the inner spaces become more important. So, because I'm an architect, I also want to learn from history. What can we take away for the planning of contemporary school building initiatives? I think that using this mid to long-term strategic planning is perhaps a good idea. I think that multidisciplinarity and also the cooperation between different countries and learning from each other is quite important. I especially like the focus on more space and more affordable space instead of iconic buildings, and also kind of a rational design briefs. And it's also, it did succeed in more equal distribution of school space and resources. What was missing? Existing buildings were not discussed at all. The use of temporary school buildings, which was proposed by the IBE very early on, did not play a role. And in particular, participation is no topic until the end of the 1970s, even if in housing, participation is discussed already during the mid-1960s. So there's no user manual for these novel spatial settings. And even if educators who are involved in these programs usually have their practical backgrounds, they fail to convey these ideas to people who are actually using these buildings. So, and this is my little tribute to the historians of education from whom I learned a lot. And this is what I've seen during the ISHE conference in Budapest. And I don't know this from other disciplines. They always include a bibliography at the end of the presentations. I didn't have one then. I didn't have it then, but I have it now. So.
Thank you. Thank you for this super interesting lecture about it. It really shares different perspective, also from our historical point of view, and it changes some changes and processes are phrased, of course, differently. There are no political debates so much, or international political debates. But I have a question. How did this divide between West and East, or Yugoslavia special? I'm for the questions. So I will start with the questions. Then you can also join in to be the first. It was a highly international setting of a very different, especially 50s, 60s. Very different countries with a different political and ideological agenda, and especially Yugoslavia here with non-aligned movement is sometimes slightly different. How did those effects influence the concrete plans? Were there any overlaps with political agenda and planning of schools? Or was this kind of debate very, let's say, engineering debate and debate on the level of experts, that those political questions were not so important? Or?
I would say that at the level of the working commissions, there were others. The UIA also had other working commissions, like the ones for urban planning, for house buildings, and so on. I think at the level of commissions, there were not so many tensions because they really tried to learn from each other and they got to know each other. They became friends, obviously. because they traveled across the world and they were hosted by different countries, and they had like really huge programs, even with ladies programs. So there was not many tensions, but with the UIA congresses, the main organization, there were a lot of tensions. The first one being the second conference should have been in Warsaw. It was then moved to Morocco, to Rabat, because of this intervention by the Polish delegation. And then, of course, there was a conference in Cuba in 1963. There was a lot of tension. Miles Glendining wrote a lot about this. The Americans were not allowed to go there. The members of the UIA were not allowed to go to Cuba. It was the height of the crisis. There was also a congress in Moscow where some didn't participate, but it was mainly the person of Pierre Vagot who tried to navigate through these different, and his credo was kind of always include everyone.
I think, yeah, very interesting. And now I please the public, online and physically present at our institution. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. Una.
Thank you, Maja, for this really interesting lecture. I have a question about, again, this sort of level of like the organization, the international, transnational, and then like the local or Yugoslav in this sense. So I was wondering about, because you mentioned that Gaspari, I think that's the name, Gaspari took some of the ideas of Roth, right, and building a school, and I was thinking about, was there any sort of, like, I don't know, reflections of him thinking about socialist education, and like, because in this time there's a lot of this, like, building a socialist human being or man, socialistički čovjek, and how is that maybe kind of tension with these ideas or not? Like, yeah, if there was some sort of dialogues maybe about this.
I don't think there were much dialogues, and these documents related to school construction and also school building regulations. There's almost no Marxist vocabulary, and there's no talk about socialist pedagogy. I know there's this discussion in Slovenia about socialist pedagogy between Medveš and I think someone called Vladimir Schmidt, but they're actually talking about contemporary education or contemporary pedagogy. So I think they were probably not well-trained Marxists at that time.
Very interesting. Thanks.
They were experts on different agenda, engineers in a way.
Yes.
So maybe the practical problems were more.
And in some way it also relate. I think there was a strong reform pedagogy movement during the interwar period, and some of the teachers who were involved in this movement, like Gustav Schillich, they were also involved with the school reform. So they were carrying on these ideas, mostly German ideas about Arbeitsschule, which go back to Kerschensteiner or the Austrian Glöckl.
Thank you. Another question? I was particularly struck by this idea, this at the beginning in the 50s, this school, it looks really kind of back to nature, small schools with open space, bungalow, and open classroom. The concept of open classroom was actually a thing, which later, I suppose, not so much. Was
This has
maybe is this an architectural historical questions? We are mostly
yeah.
only
This
political
actually has a
stories.
longer tradition. This is also heliotherapy, the healing of tuberculosis, and initiated in late 19th century. So we have these Waldstuhlen and open air classrooms in Germany, but also in the UK. So this is taken up by reform pedagogy, and then some of the ideas were already developed during the interwar period in New Frankfurt under Ernst May, and also Wilhelm Schutte built such a school in 1932, I think. And then he took them to Soviet Union, then he went to Turkey, and then he came back to Austria and built just one school like this. So yeah, these are longer traditions. And the interesting thing about is, if you look at material artifacts such as buildings or furniture or perhaps even teaching aids, then you can see all kinds of things, novel ideas, which are perhaps linked to a specific time, but then you have this longue durée. So, yeah.
Interesting. Question? Yuri?
Well, it's not a question, it's a commentary actually, or an anecdote. I don't know if you are aware of the Croatian documentary series called Betonski spavači. So,
Yes.
yes, in the last season there was a story about the school in Belgium. And this is interesting from my point of view because I've seen this idea of using different types of temporary buildings for schools, and about the idea how far were maybe Yugoslav architects, modernist architects, already influenced by the West, and also answers a little bit on the question of the ideological problems. Because the building, there was a Croatian architect, I don't remember his name, who made this pavilion for the Expo in Brussels in 1957.
Wenceslav Richter?
Yes. And this pavilion was later bought by a local parish somewhere in Belgium. And the parisher bought it because he thought that it was a perfect space for a school, a middle school.
Yes, I know about this.
It's still in existence, and it is a Catholic middle school preserved in Belgium. And actually, it was a part. I think it was a part of this. It is still named Yugoslav Pavilion, but actually, how they managed to use a building that was not supposed to be a school, and it is described as one of the best places where you can have school because of this open concept design, and because it was sorry, yeah.
Sorry.
The dog interview.
For those who are attending online, we also have a dog attending our lecture.
At that moment, sorry, the thing that fascinated me was that something that was socialist, the Yugoslav modernist architecture, which was perceived as very socialist in this area, actually was used as a Catholic middle school somewhere in the capitalist West, and that was in the 50s.
Yeah, I think it's crucial for architecture to be in some way open towards changes in uses. That's what makes good architecture, I guess, especially at times when we talk about resources or adaptive reuse. So there's a sign of quality, I would say.
Yeah, and as far as I can see, they use those principles that you were missing in the, which you mentioned that you missed in the whole system of school planning during the 60s, 50s and 60s. So practically yes, reuse. No.
I'm sorry, and it was your comment was also commented by the dog, Obviously didn't like it. We did. Maybe if any other question? Maybe this question is, this is again on the history of architecture, in general history. It's the 50s, 60s are times of this modernism, Corbusier, and also the reflections of Bauhaus and those systems. How does this typical classic, I don't know if this is the right expression, classical architectural modernism of the second half of the 20th century, how does this relate to those school buildings? Maybe those changes in the 60s and 70s were also related to the new systems.
I would say the first thing is, of course, the UIA as an organization, which emerges immediately after World War II, and they strive to join three different organizations that were global organizations for architects at that time, and CIAM, which is linked to Le Corbusier and the modern movement, does not want to join. So, and what the difference between UIA and the modern movement is that UIA is mostly about international cooperation and also using technology as a kind of a neutral vehicle, but it does not have this agenda of promoting modernist style. So our partner Andreas Kalpaki has written about this. They had a little conflict and they even signed a gentleman's agreement. None of them stuck to that agreement. I think that many of the features that were then applied to post-war school buildings were developed in the interwar era, but with the advent of the welfare state in the Western countries and also with the expansion of secondary education in the Eastern Bloc, the architects could apply these principles and concepts and ideas on a mass scale, which of course was not possible during the 1930s, where you have these multiple polycrises of the 1930s.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions or someone?
I mean, if I can ask another one if there is. So I'm sorry, I was interested in this transition or changes in education that you're talking about from the 50s of this humanist approach to this other more utilitarian, I don't know, like how would you exactly describe it? And again, I was thinking about Yugoslavia and so because there's a book about crisis of education, can you tell us maybe a bit more about this? Again, how was that translated or how that went to Yugoslavia?
I'm only just starting to look into this OECD. As far as the Mediterranean regional project is concerned, this was conducted in Turkey, Spain, Italy, Yugoslavia, and Portugal. And according to Maren Elfert, who was able to talk to one of the actors and protagonists, he himself said that it kind of failed. It wasn't really applied. And I'm only, as far as school construction is concerned, I'm only just starting to look into this, but I don't think it influenced Yugoslav school construction very much. And what is really good about the Yugoslav architects is that they have these foreign experts coming to Yugoslavia, but they're very confident in their abilities and they don't take up every idea. They turn to the West, they look what the West has, but they apply it in their own way, I would say. Yeah, and moreover, about the school building program, the DEEB OECD, I probably don't want to know this so closely, but perhaps it's not always possible to translate some concepts from one national or economic context, because the UK architect who came to these countries, to the Mediterranean countries, was trained in prefabricated metal buildings, which emerged out of this war economy in the UK, which had this industry that could build in a prefabricated mode of construction. But this was not the case for Yugoslavia, and perhaps in the other countries were also not so economically developed in this Mediterranean regional project. So, and he didn't take this into account, and the architects, except for the Portuguese, didn't take him very seriously. There's a memoir written by him, and he writes very openly about it. There are some very funny anecdotes in his book.
Was this the same who had a reply to Slovenian? And was that in the 50s?
No, that was in the 60s.
In the 50s, someone from England had, you saw it on a slide, the Slovenian
Oh,
delegate.
no, that was a different guy.
It was a different guy, because
Yes.
the Slovenian Yugoslav delegate wanted to say that let's first think about new methods and then we'll build schools, and he said, I don't agree with it. What was the story about that?
Oh, that was the modus operandi of the International Bureau of Education. They got this Poleg Wilson, which was the League of Nations palace, and they were there, and they had their simultaneous translations, and they were talking to each other. And these recommendations were prepared by the IBE team, and they did sometimes they did change some of the wordings, and sometimes they didn't agree, but mostly they agreed, and then they were happy to discuss it. But
I thought there was some more profound conceptual.
I would say the conceptual work was done by the IBE team beforehand, but that's an impressive part of it. And thanks to these diplomatic skills of Jean Piaget and others, they were able to convey this. And it did influence, I think it did influence the countries to some degree.
Maybe about Mexico, if I can ask something.
Yes, of course.
In the 50s and 60s, there was a very big dislocation of indigenous communities in Mexico from various parts of the country into the Lacandon jungle. And afterwards, with liberation theology, Paulo Freire, and 1993 rebellion of anti-neoliberal trade agreements and so on, they made their own little schools, like community schools. But I'm interested in exactly this period, 50s and 60s. Was there also reports on this kind of territorial movement of people who, how did they build schools in the jungle as well for the people? Is there any reports about that?
There is a not so much, but I know about some more like newspaper reports about this. There was this central organization in Mexico City. I don't know how to pronounce it. The acronym is TAPSTE. And there were different architects, and they developed these prototypes for schools, which were partly prefabricated elements, and then they also there was some self-built on site, and these were quite small schools, rural schools. They had one classroom and an attached teacher's apartment, which is very like the Habsburg schools of the 19th century. And they tried to, this was a typified school, so they were the same, but in a way they were a little bit adapted to the climate, or they had different styles, and they tried to spread this all over territory. And it was even, there's one triennale in Milano. One of these schools was shown there, and it's called Aula Casa Rural, and they even exported some of those schools. The interesting thing about Mexico is that after the revolution, they had this Mexican miracle, I think in the economic miracle during the 1940s, and they had a lot of money, and in a way, Mexico subsidized the school building commission during these years because they provided, they printed very elaborate proceedings of the meetings they conducted. They staged a very nice meeting in Mexico where they were shown all over the place, and I think it was, this is the picture with the airplane and the participants, which is on the poster for this lecture. So, but I'm not focusing on Mexico, unfortunately, but that would be a very good topic to explore, and how this played out to indigenous population, and how how education perhaps is repressive and progressive at the same time.
Thank you. Any other question? Maybe questions online? Do we have any? We don't. Are we now heading towards the conclusion? Then, if we don't have any questions, I will have an honor to conclude this wonderful lecture. Thank you, Maja. Thank you. It was great. It was interesting, and I'm quite surprised also by the debate. Positively surprised that there are some. Of course, those questions are very, very interesting also for, let's say, historians from different perspectives, unfortunately, those who are online do not smell the coffee, and we do. So we'll have to conclude now also to not want coffee not to become cold. And thank you for your attention, and see you again.